Chag Sameach. When I was 21 years old, I spent a year in Israel, back in Israel. And I was working as a journalist, and one of my beats that they gave to me as a journalist was to cover the Christian communities of Jerusalem, which is, also the city in the world that has the most diverse range of Christian institutions and of organizations. And so I wrote a weekly column called In Christian Jerusalem. And I'd grown up in Jerusalem. I lived there till I was 7. My parents, I'd been back and forth. My parents moved back when I was in college. I knew Jerusalem. As I began to do research, I realized there was a whole part of Jerusalem that I had no idea about. And there was suddenly opening up to me. And so I did my research, and I read many books about Christian-Jewish relationship and history in Jerusalem especially. And I had to go visit the communities that I was about to cover. So I went to discover all kinds of different communities. On Sukkot, I did the walk with the evangelicals through the streets of Israel. On Palm Sunday, when they wave the palm, they go down the Mount of Olives, have a huge procession into Jerusalem, and I covered that. And as I knew from before, those palm branches were what we use as chach on our Sukkot in Jerusalem, what we waved on Sukkot. And I'd grown up in the old city. The Kotel was my synagogue growing up, and I thought I knew it well. But then as I started to discover, started discovering Syrian Orthodox basement churches in little corners of where they still did their liturgy in Aramaic, Syrian Aramaic. And I got to know the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is one of the most important churches in the world. And I got to know all these different ancient and new churches all around the area. The histories, the mysteries, and it always been there, but I never noticed it until then. It was a whole world opening up to me, another side of Jerusalem. All types of traditions and mysteries, and the Egyptian communities and the Ethiopian communities, and how they split all their churches and the infighting. It was a whole world, really a sense of a Jerusalem that's holy to other people too, right? Jerusalem that's holy to other people. And Sukkot, the holiday that we're in, is the most universal of all of our holidays. If Pesach is about where we're coming from, then Sukkot has a whole other way of exposing us to an understanding of the world. On the one hand, of course, Sukkot, like the other holidays, does have a historical element that connects us to, as we say every year, the stories of the Jews who traveled through the desert in their booths, but there's no reading we do that really expresses that. That's not the main story of Sukkot. In fact, there is no story to Sukkot, right? If Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is about renewing our covenant, and Passover is about leaving slavery, and Shavuot is about revelation, then this is really more than anything just a holiday of joy. We live in the space of joy. We do have all these mitzvot. We have the lulav and etrog, and we have the Sukkot, and we eat in the holidays, as we just read a few minutes ago, just a holiday to rejoice for one week. Of course, in ancient times, it was even connected to the agricultural seasons and to the harvest, the late harvest, the grapes, and the olives. And it was also a holiday that was meant to be shared with others. It's the most turned outwards. And it's interesting, most of our holidays have an us versus them story embedded in it. We think of Hanukkah, we think of Purim, we think of Pesach even. But this is a holiday that has no us versus them. And it's more about the future than about the past. And the prophets, in many visions, imagined that the fulfillment of the world would come on Sukkot. This is what we read yesterday, that the end of days would be a day where all the peoples of the world would walk up to Jerusalem and look to God and say, this is the God that we were waiting for, the God we dreamt of. And that somehow the sense of the Sukkah as being open, there's almost an infinity of space in the Sukkah, and there's all these interesting conversations in the Talmud and halachic literature about how big can a Sukkah be and still be a Sukkah. Well, it can't be that tall. It can be almost infinitely big horizontally. Vertically, once you have a few floors, no longer a Sukkah, but horizontally, it can stretch and stretch and stretch. And in these visions, there's almost an imagination that pilgrims, as many pilgrims as can come, would be under a Sukkah in Jerusalem. There's so many different connections to the universal, but also in our very concept of the afterlife. When the rabbis imagine, well, what do you go to after you pass away? They imagine you eat, fish up in the heavens. You eat smoked fish up in the heavens, the fish of the Leviathan. I'm not sure it was smoked, but gefilte. But the Leviathan, and then the very skin of the Leviathan, of this creature that we eat, this fish, the flesh of in the days, is connected to the Sukkah. The Sukkah, at the end of days, will have a Sukkah made out of the flesh of the Leviathan. And even this idea of Sukkot Shalom, of a shelter of peace, it's almost as if all of us can fit into that shelter. We all can fit into that shelter of peace. That's what it'll be like at the end of days. And as we'll be reading over the days ahead, we already in our maftir, we begin, but of all the different sacrifices on the first day, the second day, the third day, we sacrifice 70 bulls over Sukkot, and they correspond to the 70 nations representing all of humanity. 70 is the number that represents everything, encompasses everybody. So it's a holiday where we're giving offerings for all people, and even people come up to the house of God, to the temple, certain areas on the holiday. So maybe Sukkot is a holiday that asks us in our hearts and minds to open ourselves up and embrace those who are on their own path to God and to godliness, and to make room for all of them in our Sukkah, and to find time and space to share even their stories and their worlds. And part of working towards that vision is realigning ourselves in all our relationships with those who are different than us, and finding an easier relationship at the time when the Jewish people don't feel very aligned with the rest of the world, or maybe more precisely, they don't feel aligned with all of us. I remember when I was in Nepal doing my volunteering work, and the head of our Jewish program was a rabbi, and he spent weeks at the beginning of every session, there were 2 sessions a year, teaching all the volunteers, mainly Israelis, but Jews from all over the world, about Jewish concepts of social justice and of environmentalism. And he said that one of the reasons he'd started this whole program in Nepal, eventually went to Africa too, and South America, and trained thousands of Israelis in doing good work. But he said that he'd heard from many young Jews living in Israel, he was an American Jew, that they often felt that they had to choose between their Judaism and their humanity, or their universal outlook. They want to be Jewish meant to only care about other Jews in their minds, and to be universal was to embrace all of humanity. And he wanted to teach them that you didn't have to do one. The Judaism is not only about identifying with our own people and carrying one's fellow Jews, but also all of humanity. And our identity is not about being different than others, but it's about, from wherever we are, embracing everyone. You want to teach everyone that Judaism, your deep Judaism can be the gateway to your humanity. So Sukkot is that holiday where, feeling so deeply planted in our Judaism after the holidays, we also embrace from that place of confidence the whole world in all of its beautiful diversity and all of its paths and spirit, while holding on to the underlying oneness of all of it. Chag Sameach.